You may or may not be familiar with the incident that happened in Los Angeles County on September 11th, 2021, during the brush fire known as the Route Fire. The short clip on the internet collected over 1 million views, but left many unanswered questions. I'd like to answer some of those questions, and I'll start with a very brief recap of the incident. At 3:54 p.m., a brush fire was reported in the Angeles National Forest, 1 hour north of Los Angeles. The U.S. Forest Service and Los Angeles County each dispatched a brush fire response. The number of resources sent upon the first report of a fire totaled about 12 engines, 5 crews, 3 water trucks, and more than a dozen other resources, such as dozers, patrols, and overhead. Just minutes later, 6 fixed-wing aircraft and 8 helicopters were assigned to the fire. The first resources on scene reported 1 acre burning in light to medium fuels with a moderate rate of spread. The Forest Service quickly ordered a second alarm, bringing in additional fire suppression resources. The fire was burning well, benefiting from low fuel moistures, light winds, and hot and dry weather. The fire spread uphill from the highway to the interstate freeway. The wind was blowing from east to west, but seemed to have little influence on the fire. As units arrived, they tried to anchor the bottom of the fire, but heavy fuels, fire, and smoke made attempts at containment ineffective. A lower-level wind began pushing the fire to the west, opposing the predominant wind, and so the fire spotted west of the highway, becoming well established. Additional units attempted to contain the spot fire, but fire intensity made direct attack unsuccessful. About this time, aircraft began arriving on scene and began to anchor the fire from the westernmost point. As the fire progressed north along both sides of the highway, several engines and 2 hand crews began traveling north ahead of the slow-moving fire, now approximately 20 acres in size. Minutes later, blocked from view by terrain, the fire made a rapid quarter-mile run around the firefighters on the highway. The fire changed direction as the column began to rotate, crossing the highway north of the firefighters and cutting off their escape route. Moments before, one of the hand crews left the group, narrowly avoiding the encirclement. That left 10 crew members plus their foreman and 2 engine captains out on foot. These 13 firefighters loaded in the remaining 2 fire engines, and the 23 firefighters were evacuated from the area as the fire closed in, damaging 1 engine. I received burns to my face and arm, and at least 2 others received burns to their necks. The fire then spotted northeast across the freeway, where it would burn a total of 464 acres. Now that you've seen the overview of this incident, you should be wondering why we were out in front of the fire. You may also be thinking the situation is easy to understand. After all, there was no lookout. Case closed. Well, if you've already figured it out, then congratulations. If you're a student of fire, I think your time would be better spent studying other incidents you might not be familiar with, such as the Panther Fire or the Devil's Den Fire. I don't know how much you're going to learn from the Route Fire. Continuing on, for those of you still here, you might be interested to know that we did have lookouts. Why were the lookouts inadequate? Was it inexperience, or a communication problem, or something else? I wanted to try and keep the video short, so I'll have to answer that question in a future video. However, I can answer 2 of the more common questions I get. Number 1, why in the world did those guys bring tools into the engine? And number 2, why don't your American trucks have a sprinkler system like we have in Australia? I can only offer my guess to that last question. In the last 30 years, how many instances have there been in the United States where firefighters took refuge in a fire engine and then died as a result? I can think of it happening maybe once, but I don't think it's something that happens with any kind of measurable regularity. Someone might suggest, well, if sprinklers will save just 1 life, it'll be worth it. But if that was how we made decisions, all of us would carry proximity suits, all fire vehicles would be hermetically sealed like the presidential limousine, and Canadians would carry fire shelters. Realistically, we have limited resources, and so we identify the pros and cons of safety measures, and we put our resources where they will solve the most likely problems faced in our local area. Would I carry a 20-pound fire shelter and drive around in a sprinkler-protected truck if it made me safer? Well, if I had my choice, I think if we redirected that money, I would be safer if more of us were sent to L580, which is leadership training if you don't know. That's just my opinion. Back to the first question. Why were tools and gear carried into the engine? When have you ever participated in a drill where you ran from fire, ditched your fire shelter, then jumped into a foreign truck. You might think the guys should have ditched their gear and taken out their fire shelter, and maybe have even grabbed the radio too. The guys were starting to burn as they were getting into the engine. If they had delayed any number of seconds, we are looking at more burned people and deeper burns. You should know that for some of these crew members, it was their first fire, and nobody told them to drop tools. In an emergency, what we typically expect from firefighters is don't panic, revert to your training, follow instructions. They did what I would expect of them. Why didn't I tell them to drop tools? I didn't even give it a thought. I had other things on my mind. When I first contacted the crew, I remember taking mental pictures, trying to estimate how many there were without actually counting, and whether or not it was a full 20-person crew. That took about 4 seconds, but I remember it being only a fraction of a second. After I turned to head back to my engine, I knew that dropping packs would be disastrous because the fire was already on us. The video doesn't show the speed of the fire and the location to our left as we ran back to the engine. My race back to the truck took another 4 seconds. But time slowed down, and my one thought was how many of them would fit in the engine. I visualized the layout of the cab and pictured guys stacked on one another, and I began counting them in my mind. I was way off, though, because I thought we could only fit an additional 5 with gear, and I thought there were more than 10 following behind me. My only concern was fitting as many as we could as fast as we could. So what were the rest of us going to do who couldn't fit? I don't know. I ran out of time to plan as the fire reached us. Protecting my airway, deploying our fire shelters, running down the road through the flames, climbing in a hole, holding onto the engine while John drove us out of there. Those were my considerations. When I opened the door to our truck with the crew behind me, I also had zero concern for where the fire was because when I got out of the engine 11 seconds prior, I knew we were already out of time. Not once did I think about telling those guys to drop their tools. Look for another video coming out later this year.